In addition to being a poet, you're a very accomplished editor, and you've put together a number of anthologies, most recently Black Nature, which is an anthology of African American nature poetry. What motivated you to put together that anthology?
One of the reasons that we write is to see the world reflected in a way that makes sense to us, to answer the questions that we have about how the world is the way it is, and to also describe it for others. And for some of us as writers, it's also about being able to illustrate the world as we see it, as we know it, as we haven't necessarily seen it displayed. Similar urgencies come behind my editing, that I know that there's work out there that describes feelings and experiences and visions that I recognize, but I don't see them presented in the canonical tradition, for instance, and I don't see them presented in contemporary anthologies and journals. And then as an editor, part of my charge is to gather those works together and say, look, we're out here. We're doing this really interesting thing. There are people out here saying things in a way that you will respond to. And so with Black Nature, I had grown weary of people coming up to me and saying, I never really thought about Black people writing about nature, or I don't really know that many Black people who write about the natural world, because I knew plenty of amazing poems and poets who were writing very intelligently and in complex and engaging manners about the natural world. And so I decided to show everybody else that we were out there doing that.
One of the things that strikes me about that anthology is its diversity, not just in terms of aesthetics, but in terms of content. So you have some poems you would naturally call nature poems, poems about beautiful landscapes, poems about gardens, but then you include, say, Richard Wright haiku that begins, I pay rent for the lice living in my cold room, that feels, or the
for the moon and also the lice. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, mm-hmm. Which feels like a very urban poem. What were your parameters? How were you thinking about what constitutes nature poetry?
Well, part of the reason why African American writers have not been represented in the normative view of what nature poetry is, which is, as you described it, wilderness poetry, where people wander out into the natural world in the woods and feel at home and come to some sort of sense of resolution and epiphany about the inner peace of the soul, right? That's a little bit more complicated for a people with a history with trees in America. That's a brutal, violent, often scary history. And so part of the reason that our work hasn't been as widely represented is because it complicates ideas of what our relationship with the natural world is. So very frequently these poems have a political bent, they have a historical perspective involved, they are not necessarily poems about a piece or a nostalgic response to the world where some time ago something lovely happened on this space, right? Some time ago, usually something horrible happened in this space. And so it was important to really open up what we could allow into the world of poetry written in relationship to the natural world. And so I changed a lot of expectations of what it is that you might find in those poems. And by changing those expectations, I then was able to open the doors somewhat to what could be included.
And did your work, I imagine that reading all of these poems in some ways changed your idea of what constitutes nature poetry, your own ideas. Did that then feed back into your work as a poet? How do you see the relationship between your work as an editor and your work as a poet?
There is a relationship between my work as an editor and my work as a poet, but I don't think that collecting this anthology changed my views. I think collecting this anthology simply articulated my views. So my views about nature poetry had already been complex in this way, and so I'd already thought that I was writing with specificity about a complicated and often problematic relationship with the natural world. And so I just thought that what I was writing was not represented. And I thought that the work that I admired that was also working in this way was not represented. And I thought it was important that that become represented and that be collected in an authoritative manner. And so the anthology is an offshoot of the thinking that I already had. The ways that editing anthologies like this, I also in the same time period co-edited the From the Fish House anthology, an anthology of poems that sing, rhyme, resound, syncopate, alliterate, and just plain sound great. And so collecting in the same general time period about 400 of my favorite poems really did make me pay a lot of attention to what it is that I love in a poem and what challenges me and what excites me. And so when I was writing my own poems at that time, I could be a much more specific critic of my own work, that this is or is not doing what I believe is important. And so I could pay attention to that. But that has a lot to do, as much to do with content as style, as formal questions. It just allows me, when I'm really focusing that carefully on other people's work, it really allows me to incorporate things that I admire and to also grapple with things that I don't admire.
What is it that you love in a poem?
What is it that I love in a poem? I was trying to think about that last night as I read Lucille Clifton's poetry. Her collected works for about 4 hours and couldn't put the book down. And was trying to figure out what it is that I love. Part of it is that I was reading through older work and lines just came forward out of poems that I remember the moment when I first encountered that line, and that feeling of that first encounter doesn't go away in each new instance. And so it's love, right? It's love when you remember the love at first sight moment, and then you layer upon that every other experience. So there's some way that good poetry connects with me on a deeply illogical level. It just stirs me somehow. And then I can go back and figure out the logic of how it's working and why, and what the sounds are at play, and how different adjectives are playing against other parts of the grammatical construction of the line, and how the sentence plays against the end of the lines, and all of these other logical, technical things. But there's something, the poem has to do something pre-logical to stir that connection to me.